The nervous system is a network of specialized cells that conduct electrical messages throughout our body. These messages end up controlling our muscular system, all the muscular contractions of our body, and as well as our endocrine glands in order to maintain homeostasis, urging those glands to secrete hormones. Now, the nervous system is divided into two major nervous systems: the central nervous system, composed of the brain and the spinal cord, as well as the peripheral nervous system, shown here in blue, all of the nerves throughout the body. The neuron is the basic cell of the nervous system. All nervous system cells have these main features. You can see that it's a cell. You see the nucleus there in this expanded portion of the cell called the cell body. This is where the nucleus and all the other organelles of the cell are mostly located. Branching out often from the cell body are small, short fibers called dendrites, and these are going to receive signals. They're like almost like an antenna network that will receive the incoming signals. Outgoing signals are propagated down one long single fiber called an axon, typically the longest fiber emanating from the cell body. And this axon ends in small connections to other cells called axon terminals. Now, along the length of this axon are these myelin sheaths, wrapping from another type of cell entirely. The membrane of another cell wraps around the axon to form these myelin sheaths. And then there are places in between these myelin sheaths, these gaps where the axon is exposed, and those are called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, neurons can come in a variety of shapes and appearances depending on their location in the nervous system. For instance, this nervous cell in the brain has many dendrites because it needs to make so many connections with other cells. In fact, some of neurons can make up to 10,000 connections with other cells. And often these neurons are arranged in a vast, dense network of nerve fibers, all connected to each other in these neural pathways. Now, there are three basic steps composing the nervous system response to a stimulus. So we're going to use our volleyball player here setting up to hit this volleyball as an example. Now, the first step is to receive that sensory input. So we see here the player is observing the location of the ball, that sensory information coming in, and that sensory information is going to get transmitted to the central nervous system via a special type of neuron called sensory neurons. So link sensory in your mind with incoming messages. Then a step called integration will be performed. This is performed by specialized cells of the central nervous system called interneurons. Integration is when these interneurons summarize all of the incoming messages in order to determine the appropriate response. And then we have our last step, the response itself, which we call a motor output. The volleyball player is going to hit the ball as a response to this stimulus of observing it. And that motor output is propagated to the correct muscles via a specialized kind of neuron called the motor neuron. So sensory neurons bring the message in, interneurons make sense of that message, and motor neurons carry the message back out to stimulate the correct muscles or glands. Now, these neurons propagate these messages. They send these messages called action potentials. This is an electrical message, and these typically begin in the dendrites. So remember, the dendrites is antenna network that receives signals. After being formed in those dendrites, they then move towards the axon of the neuron and travel down that axon in a specific direction until they meet the next cell. So let's take a look at the transmission of an action potential down an axon. So we see here a cartoon indicating three adjacent segments of an axon. So we're going to move from left to right here as we go on. So here's an axon of a neuron. And along the membranes are embedded these gated sodium channels, these channels that can open and close, allowing sodium ions to enter, as well as gated potassium channels that will allow potassium ion to enter and leave. Now, very important to understand is that the inside charge of a neuron is typically negative at rest. So when no action potential is coming through, the internal charge is negative. The first step to occur to trigger an action potential is the opening of the sodium channel. So you can see here the sodium channel has opened and sodium ions are going to be allowed to enter. Now the influx of all this positive charge changes that localized negative charge to a positive one, and we call this, and you can think of that as flipping the switch to positive. This is an action potential. An action potential has begun. Now in the next step, the sodium channel on the adjacent section is going to open as a result of the first section stimulating it, and that action potential is going to be generated in the next section. Meanwhile, in the first section that we considered previously, now we're going to close that sodium channel, open the potassium channel, and the positive cation potassium ion is going to get pumped out of the first section. Now we're losing that positive charge, thus we go back to a negative charge in the first section, shutting down the action potential there. So now we have an action potential in the second segment occurring. This is going to stimulate the next section to open a sodium channel, flip the switch, and then the previous section removes potassium and goes back to a resting negative potential. And in this way, the action potential is propagated down the axon one section at a time, with sodium coming in to generate the action potential and potassium leaving to restore it back to its negative resting state.